Hi everyone, Karen Alari here. In today's small talk, I want to talk a little bit about shadows, painting shadows and light. I'm going to use some versions of my own paintings to show you examples in what we're talking about today. So basically, getting your shadows right and getting that contrast in your painting can be very satisfying as a painter and can really help bring your paintings to life and make them seem more realistic. Even if you're working in a more impressionistic style, I'll show you some examples of that too. It still has a lot of impact and helps really draw the viewer into your painting. So let's break this down a little bit and look at what shadows are. Okay, so first of all, when you have a shadow, you're going to have a shift in your value. So there's going to be a contrast from light to dark. That's pretty self-explanatory. But one thing I often notice with beginners, there's a tendency not to put a strong enough value shift. They don't make their lights light enough and their darks dark enough to really see, to have that pop. So value shift, and the second thing is color, temperature of your color. So temperature means warm and cool. So warms, reds, oranges, those are warms. Blues and greens are cool colors, but even within those colors you can have a warm green and a cool green. So shadows and light, you're either going to have your light is going to be warm colored, and if it is, then your shadows are going to be cool. Or if your light is cool, like sometimes in the middle of the day, in different situations, your light will be cool. And if that's the case, then your shadows will be warm. You just want to remember that you have to have that contrast. Most of the time, I would say I paint most of the time warm lights and cool shadows. It's just more pleasing to me. So those are two things that are really going to come across. And so I want to talk a few things that people tend to do wrong when they're beginning. So they'll tend to do a warm light and a warm shadow. So maybe they'll have some sand and it'll be sort of a warm sandy color in the light, but then they'll make the shadow just a warm brown, darker but still warm. And that isn't quite as effective. So let's take a look at this little painting that I did. And I'm going to sample these colors just so that you can see. And if you check over here in this little box, you can see what those colors are. And that's kind of shows you. So here's the cement in light, the sidewalk in light, and you can see what a warm peachy color that is. And then when it goes into the shadow, it's a much cooler purpley color. The same here on this building. Here's a warm peachy color, and then when it goes into the shadow, it's a cooler version of that color. That's another thing that to remember is that, the shadow is simply the same element without light hitting it. And that sounds kind of simplistic, but I will often see someone putting the same color, say make it a blue shadow, so maybe that shadow is going across both a building that's orangish color and a sidewalk that's more of a gray color, but they'll use the same color for the shadow. So just remember that you're going to have a cooler version of the color, the local color of the element that you're painting. So local color means the color it is, just without shadow and light. So that's something to think about there. The other thing is the values. Even dark colors. So for example, this guy's wearing a dark gray shirt. And you can see how dark it is here in the shadow. And in the sunlight, it's very light. So you get that strong contrast is what's making this really feel like light here. You're really seeing the light. This is black, but black and black and sunlight is going to be lighter than this, which is a white board. You can see how dark the value of that light board is. I'll pull it up here. You can see how dark that value is versus, even though this element is white, versus his shirt, which is black, but in sunlight it's going to be much lighter. We tend to get caught up in the local color, what color that element is, and we put that first over the sunlight. And first you got to think about the contrast in the sunlight and make sure that all the elements that are in shadow are darker than all the elements that are in sunlight. So even though this is a dark gray shirt, it's going to be lighter than this whiteboard in shadow. Okay, makes sense? That's what really makes it pop. Same thing here. You've got the black, this black awning is light here and dark here. Even these white letters, they're still reading as white letters, but look at how dark that is. It's not white at all, versus in the sunlight, they're much lighter. So you want to keep that a big value contrast and light, warm, cool, dark. Don't worry about the local color. First get those value shifts in, and then it'll look right. Here's a more sort of impressionistic version of light and shadow. Again, warm light back here and cool shadow. And here's another element that really helps make your paintings pop, is if you put the same item, in this case it's bluebell, these bluebell flowers, in shadow and in sunlight. And you get that big contrast of the same element, and you see the color shifting to much darker and much cooler, and then in the sunlight it's warmer. You see how that contrast of the same element right next to each other, instead of putting, okay, here's a rock in sunlight and here's a rock in shadow, for example, put a rock that goes halfway between sunlight and shadow, and then you're going to get a really strong sense of sunlight. You can see again the big value shift here, and that shows the sunlight versus the shadow. Here's another one. When you're working with shadows, another thing that people tend to do is they want to make their shadows very gray and dull. And if you're working from a reference photo, that often kind of happens, is it looks like it's just black or gray or dull. You don't want to do that. Put the color in your shadow. You want to get those rich, transparent colors into your shadow. You don't want it to be dull and flat. So you can see I've got some vivid purples in these shadows, and I've also brought in some blues, which would be light reflecting from this blue sky. So I've used some of that same blue color and brought that into the shadow as well. So again, here's this orange house in sunlight and in shadow, and you can see that's just a cooler, darker version of what's out here. See how that putting these shadowed colors back here in the tree, creating those shadow colors first, and then coming in on top of those with the light, and having areas where the darkest shadows meet right up next to the lightest lights, create that contrast and that interest and that feeling of light and shadow. Another thing that people have a tendency to do when they're making a color lighter in order to be in the light is they'll just add white to it. And if you just add white to a color, your color is going to get cooler because titanium white will cool your color down. So always when you're trying to move to a lighter color, add white because you got to bring the value up, but you're also going to want to add yellow or red or a warm color to warm that color up a little bit. See, if I had just made this color here pure titanium white, it would look very cool. That's got a little bit of yellow in it and probably a little bit of red in it versus the very blue color of the shadow. You still know that's white, but it's in shadow. And again, that where you have the same element right next to each other, you can really see the shadow. As again in here, you have these orange flowers in the sunlight and then in the shadow. And that contrast is what really, there's still variation, there's still color in the shadow, it's just darker and cooler. Kind of beating the same drum here, but it's the concepts are pretty simple. It's just doing them. So here's another thing that showing you about the color in shadow. All these colors in the shadow are very vivid. You can see over here, there's purples and blues. They're not dull, they're not gray, but you can tell they're shadow. They read as shadow because they're cooler and they're comparing to these warm colors. Same colors, these yellows in light versus these yellows in shadow. Contrast those again. Um, Here's another version. So here's a more realistic version. So those others are more colorful. Like this one is very colorful and vibrant and impressionistic, which I love painting. But you can also do that in a more realistic style. Your colors are just more muted, but you're following the same concepts of cooler and warmer, the same element in light and shadow. And you've got the cooler versions. Here's the cooler yellows in shadow versus the warmer, brighter yellows in the sunlight. So here's one last example to talk about shadow and light. Again, dappled light is always so successful in paintings. You want to be careful with your shadows to create some, don't do harsh lines. So you can see how there's sort of a transition value between the shadow color and the brightest sunlight, and that creates a softer edge around these dappled light areas. But again, bright sunlight and you get this vivid warm green, and then going into the cool shadows with these cool blue greens. Still variation. It's still not just one color. It's still colorful. It's not black or gray or dull, but it's cooler and darker as well in the trees, and is creating that contrast between those. So I hope these ideas are helpful to you. Pretty simple things: warm light, cool shadows, cool light, warm shadows. As you add white to make your colors lighter, if you're going for warm light, be sure to add some warming colors to warm that up. You'll actually see the warmer the light is, if it's moving more towards an orange light, you're going to see the complementary color. So you're going to see the shadows being more blue. And if the light is more of a yellow light, you see the shadows going more purple. There's kind of a complementary color orientation between the two of those, which are really fun. So I hope this is helpful for you and kind of show you some of the usual mistakes that people make when they're starting out with, having warm light, warm shadow, having dull colors in the sun, in the shadow, and then also not getting a big enough value shift between the sun and the light. This painting here, this Path in the Park, that's going to be my next full-length course on my online school. So be sure and check the info if you want more information about that. And thanks for joining me on today's Small Talk. I'll be talking to you soon.